So, I am still Michele Leroux Bustamante since a minute ago, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Alliance, which is a consulting org based, well, we're actually kind of global, but I'm based in San Diego. And also the founder of a product called Policy Server, which is an authorization system. And I'm here to talk to you about getting authorization right in .NET. We're going to talk about, how the modern techniques are available to us in .NET 9 plus or even 8 plus, and also for ASP.NET Core. So without a pause, I will continue. So I'd like to start by, so I have a long history in identity. I've been doing, identity for about 20 or so years, right? And a lot of that is about authentication first. And authentication and authorization are not the same, right? But they do go hand in hand frequently. And way back in the day, they were always coupled, right? Everything you knew about the user was including their roles, for example. But it's hard to do authorization correctly because it's usually pretty complicated. There's a lot of ways to do it. That includes things like whether you're doing role-based RBAC, whether you're doing permission-based, which is just more granular or fine-grained. It also has to do with attributes, which might not just be static permissions, but also information in context, like the time of day or the age of the person or some other attributes of the person. Then we have resource-based, which is now sort of encroaching on entitlements. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then in addition, we have sort of a newer term called context-based, which allows us to commingle all of the above into a more rich experience, okay? So there's a lot to think about, but obviously this talk is about the practical matter of how do I enforce things. I think it's still important to understand the breadth of the topic so that you can think about how I would approach some of the design aspects, right? There's no real one solution for authorization. You'll probably see there's a lot of tools out there like OPA and others that are bundled with Auth0, for example, and Okta. And then, there used to be products that were based on a frightening standard called XACML that was, many 65-page specs of its own, mostly implemented in government and in appliances because nobody liked it. And now we've got new protocols forthcoming, like Authzen, if you've heard of it. It's intended to be, with the support of OpenID Foundation, which of course is, backing identity standards as well. A new protocol to simplify the approach around XACML. It's not really supposed to be XACML, but they're dangerously close to copying that because now there's all this talk of, additional, let's say, attestations at the end where, you have obligations after you complete your request. So I won't dive into that. I just wanted to point out that there's an attempt to standardize. We don't know where it's going yet. Things like this have failed before. The jury's out as to whether or not it will, really lift off, but it is an active work right now, which means a lot of products will probably start to try to follow that. Now, coming back to the challenges with authorization, it's all the different ways to do it. It's that there's no real standard, so you have to think about it yourself. And essentially, that blur between what's a business rule versus what is an authorization static, demand that I need to make is always sort of interesting. You have to think about it, right? So ultimately, authorization is extremely design intensive, right? We have to, take a look at the, landscape of our solutions, and then possibly look at also, the complexity of the user base. Are they multi-tenant? Are there project-based context? Are there just a simple 6 or 7 roles, which means maybe you just put it in the token because you don't care? Or are there literally hundreds of roles, which I've seen before, and we could condense them if we went to a permission model, but then we would have to have something to deal with the size of permissions that we send to each application. So there's lots to talk about there. You have to do the thinking up front. It's a little bit, intense if you don't, because you might just throw something together and then find that you paint yourself in a corner, right? So you don't just install a solution for authorization. Even if you get a tool, you have to do the design up front, just to point that out. So that's the sad news. The good news is once you know what you're doing, or if it's a simple environment, we can just start writing some code. So we'll focus on that, right? So authorization is not the same as authentication, right? Or the other way around. Authentication is not equal to authorization, because authentication is about who are you, the user? Have I vouched for you as, who you say you are, right? And how have you attested to who you are? Was it done with MFA? Was it done with, some other multi-factor capability? How do I know you are user ID 123, basically? Do I know that I can trust letting you into the application because you actually have an account in here? And that's just the basics, right? You mainly care when you go to an identity system about the user subclaim, which is the user ID. And that ID should be immutable, never change for you, so that you can associate that user from the identity system to the assets you own in the application or the system, right? So that's a very important distinction. And then obviously authorization is a layer on top. So authorization is more about what are you allowed to do, which, again, if you couple those to the identity system, then you are in danger of adding a lot of business logic and complexity into that system, especially as the list of roles and permissions grows over time. So the challenge is then with coupling, besides the fact that they don't belong together, is that you might end up with more and more roles over time, because nobody's happy with the first 3 roles you created. You had a guest and a user and an admin, and now we need an admin plus and an admin minus and a user that fits only this area of the system and that area of the system. And literally the sprawl can be leading to hundreds of roles. And when you put that in the token, guess what happens to the token? It gets bigger, and then you can't really pass it around eventually, unless you do tricky things like trying to do server-side caching of those properties. And now we get into different problems, which is something like, if I cache it, how long are those permissions good for? What if they should expire after 10 minutes, and the token is held around for longer? Then now we're looking at a token with something that may not be valid anymore. So there are definitely issues there. So role explosion is the number one problem. Token bloat is the secondary, side effect to that, especially if the roles get many for a single user. Customers I have that have, special users that have every role in the system because they want to test. So they don't test by creating different profiles. They test by giving themselves every role, and then all of a sudden they find out those are the users that, when you make a change to the system, have so many roles that they get really slow behavior, and they're wondering why. But ultimately, it means there's a flaw in the system that's not handling growth, right? So that's the bigger problem to solve. Long-lived permissions, I mentioned that, right? The intrusion of the business logic into your identity provider or your login provider, because if I have to, go through business logic to see if you get the permission, like, do you have read rights on this object? Well, I now have to go look at the database, check the object, and see if you were the owner of it, or if you are an admin over that account. So that gets kind of overlapping with what we call entitlements and what we call, really resource-based access control. So it starts to blend that business logic with your authorization logic and your identity logic. And the loss of context really just means when we are trying to do authorization, it might matter what my IP address was, what geography I'm in right now. Maybe there's a certain rule in the system that says, I have some systems where the tenant model is there's people in UK and there's people in US. And depending which one you're in right now, that governs a lot of authorization that comes back in the system. And you don't really have the ability to add that type of logic into your identity system. So I guess the bottom line is, we want authentication to do its job, which is who are you and are you authenticated, and then authorization to have a separate life and a separate life cycle that can be tuned to the requirements. So there's a different level of complexity we might encounter. You can start with just basic role-based, which sometimes just looks at, do you have a valid token? That's just, actually not even role-based. Are you authenticated, or do you have an API token that works, right? That's the basics for authorization. The next would be on the API, does this application have the right to call it, which is a scope usually? And then the next layer would be roles. So do we have roles in the token? The next layer would be permissions, which now starts to get into how many permissions are there at the application? Are there hundreds? Could I have all 100? Is that token going to get too big? Should I be taking it out of there? And we start looking at different ways to get that. And then you can also require claims or attributes. So all of these are technical implementations that are available in the ASP.NET Core framework around authorization that we'll look at, right? So again, you can do authorization, authentication, API scopes, attributes, roles, permissions, claims, and then the complex customizations you can do can also help you connect to an external system. So I'll just sort of take you through all of that. So let's start with the basics. How many people already do identity, like OpenID Connect, redirect to an external identity provider? Okay, so a lot of people do, some still don't, not uncommon. There's a lot of applications out there that still do username, password direct to the database behind. Sometimes it's because you're stuck with legacy and you just don't know how to change it. Maybe somebody left the company, nobody wants to touch the code, they're afraid it'll blow up. That happens too. At the end of the day, most folks are trying to migrate to OpenID Connect, and the reason is because it's more secure. If you read OWASP or NIST, they clearly state that it is deprecated to do what they call resource owner password flow, where an application sends a username password to a server and gets authenticated, including mobile. So even your mobile devices are supposed to use a redirect flow like OpenID Connect to be, secure according to the standards. The exception to that rule is sometimes you buy frameworks or you plug into like Okta or Auth0 who give you these tools that still give you native login and probably try to augment some of the flaws of that protocol. But what that means is they're not following protocol when they do that for the convenience of what the customer wants, right? So that's what we run into a lot there. So not to spend too much time on OpenID Connect, just to point out how important it is. And when we set that up, what we're doing is we're adding authentication, right? So we'll go through this, but we're adding authentication, right, to our, let's say our UI application first. And then we're going to tell it, what the scheme is and what our redirect will be. We're calling our redirect scheme identity. And then we've got our OpenID Connect options, which we were setting up later. And we've got obviously a cookie to store the state on the server side, and a client, HTTP client, so that we can call back to the token endpoint. So there's a couple things to set up. These are the basics. And then on the services side, we need to configure all those settings. So the authority is my identity provider. Obviously, we don't put open secrets in here. This is just to illustrate. So you have to have access to a client ID and secret to go get your tokens on the back. So you redirect, come back, then you call the token endpoint, get the tokens afterwards. And then we're adding scopes that we're requesting from the identity provider. Like, I want the scope to call that API. It's called API. Could be API 1, 2, 3, could be the read API, the report API, whatever you want to call it. But that would grant this calling application, a claim that says it's allowed to call that API, which would be used for authorizing the app-to-app, point-to-point, right? Not the user. So it's a layer on top. And then, of course, we have to indicate which claims we're using for name or role. That's just part of OpenID Connect because it'll default to those really, really old standards like they had with SAML. Really long metadata standards with a URI like HTTPS, forward, et cetera, from the SOAP days even, actually. And so you turn that off by saying, inbound claims map false, and then you give it the actual name of the name claim and the name of the role claim, okay? So just a simple, show there. And then once you've set that up, our application will do the redirect and come back, as long as we tell the application it needs to, which means you need to be unauthorized. So we need to tell the application that you're unauthorized by adding, authorization. You can set up the DI services up here, and then ultimately what we're doing is, this is just setting up, I'm going to call an API from my app, so what's the address? And then here we're saying, when we set up the builder, we're going to use authentication first, then we're going to use authorization. And so the last step is I got to require authorization right here, right? So that's the thing that's going to tell the application by default, everything needs a user to be logged in. So everything needs a user token or essentially a claims principal attached to the request thread. So in summary, this is just the basics to set up for your initial OpenID Connect view. So I'm going to show a couple examples. I'm going to start with that simple one, and then we'll start digging into some other ideas, okay? So I'm using Aspire here, basically just because it's super cool, and it helps me set up an identity system, and then the API, and then the UI, and it lets me kind of run it all in one so that it's, it does dynamic discovery and sets up a nice little area for me to look at that, plus end-to-end tracing and cool things like that. So if you haven't used it, this will be cool for you too. Anybody used Aspire? A couple people only? Yeah, this is super cool. So that's the host setup, basically. So I've got Aspire going. And then the other thing we're going to do is I'll go first to the UI. So in my UI, I've got a program CS with the code that I just showed you, right? So, basically in here, we're adding authentication, as you can see. And ultimately, we're setting up all the rules for OpenID Connect Redirect. And it's going to that identity system I'm running with Aspire. And then I'm going to, add the authorization services as well. And then ultimately, I am going to map my Razor pages. Now, I'm not requiring authorization here yet, so let me just run it and show you what's going to happen. And let me just, Control C. So I'm going to rerun the app. And then let me just right-click here. I'm doing that so I can go to I could just click the link, but it's better if you use incognito so it doesn't give weird messages. So here is basically the Aspire interface showing all the things I'm running from that. And then I'm going to go ahead and just click on the user interface. I'm not signed in right now, so if I try to hit this token, I get unauthorized. And then I actually haven't set up these endpoints yet. So this is the first one. It's just a basic get my claims inside the app. So when I sign in, because I clicked sign in, something must have told it to redirect to log in, right? So I'm going to log in as Bob. And when I get token now, it'll send me back my tokens. So what you can see here is I've got a scope of API. I've got a role of user and a role of role 2. And those are the main things we care about right now, okay? So that came back in my token. So why did it redirect? Because if I head over to my pages, so this is using the newer kind of Razor pages form instead of just showing you MVC like probably everybody's seen before. Obviously, a lot of these concepts work also with MVC and with API controllers as well, right? So this is just illustrating a new thing. And there are some limitations with pages I'll show in a second. So if we go to our sign-in, you can see that it says authorize here. So that's what's causing it to do the redirect, because I said I want to authorize here. So I can turn that off and then instead go to the program CS, which would be a better practice, right? And I'm going to set it up by default. So let's go here, require authorization, and we'll get rid of this guy. And let me stop running and rebuild. Oh, I got to save. Excuse me. Try again. Yeah. Okay, try again. So what I did now is I turned on require authorization at the root so that it will, by default, every single page require that I'm authorized, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click that link. Copy. There we go. And then we will go back here, run it again. You have to run it again with a new token every time, so it gives you a fresh discovery result. So I'm going to go click here. I'm going to sign out. I'm going to click here, I'm going to sign in, and it's not getting it done. So what's happened is, there's something missing that I didn't turn on here, so I'm going to go ahead and click this. And let's go to the index page, which is my page up here. So let's go to here. And basically, the main page just isn't even working when I try to redirect at all. So because I now secured everything, it's not letting me go where I want to go to initiate the login, okay? And so what I'm going to do is, and then I'll just check this. So this is my sign out, which has authorize, and this is my sign in. That's the other reason, actually. There was two things. So my sign in didn't have an authorize, didn't do the redirect. The other one, anonymous, would be locked down because I turned on, requests, so I couldn't get to the main page, but that would have happened after. So I'm going to run it again, and let's see. Now I've got, oops. Yeah, actually, I don't need that anymore. Okay. I just turned myself around. Let me just go back. So let me copy this to the clipboard and go back to my Aspire. Oops. And, okay, so here we've got a sign in, which does the redirect now, and then Bob, log in, get token, and I get everything back. So I sort of went through that a little bit haphazard and missed a step. Okay, so that was just showing how do I do a basic, enforcement, right? Require authorization, going back to the program. So require authorization here on all the Razor pages is what causes it to protect all the pages unless I do allow anonymous. So, and this is the allow anonymous that I needed because it wasn't able to get to that page to do, the results. So let's go back here. So what you saw is allow anonymous. That's just the usual way to let something be open, but you want secure by default. Pretty simple, right? And we've done it before with different terms in traditional MVC. The authorize attribute is where you can secure each page or a method, but in pages, Razor pages, they don't let you do it on the actual page methods, right? It only lets you do it at the page as a whole. So if you need more granular control, then you won't use pages, you'll use MVC controller, or you'll use an API controller, for example, right? Because that will let you do at the method level. Typically, though, it's much better if you try to couple together anonymous things separately from things that require authorization. And in addition, what I would also try to do is group things that need different kind of authorization together, right? Like if this is all admin, then put them all together, make it a little bit easier to manage and maintain so that the whole set of methods are all secured in a similar way. And then on select methods, you could step up and ask for more. But at the base, you've got the highest amount of security that applies to all those methods, all those pages together, okay? That would be like a good practice. So the authorize attribute we saw, we can, later we can also talk about how you can centralize policies. So in MVC, in the UI, in Razor pages, in API controllers, what I just showed is the standard, right? Adding the authentication, adding the authorization, requiring authentication, requiring authorization, and then having, maybe select anonymous endpoints. And, that's the main difference. So. Another thing that is interesting here, if you want to think about step up. So imagine I log in, and then at some point, one of my controllers says, look, I care about whether or not you logged in with this identity provider versus that identity provider. So we could prompt something, or essentially, you could be unauthorized because you're not with the right identity provider. So just as a point of example, I'm going to go over here to my... let me go to the sign-in page. So here you'll see I've got another attribute where I'm saying authorize with this scheme identity. Now the scheme currently is identity, so this is going to work, right? So what I'm going to do instead is just change it to something that's incorrect, and then I'll shut this down and restart. And what it'll do is when it goes to check my token or my, my current claims principal, it's not going to find the scheme matching this, so it's going to say you need to leave. Now, obviously, we don't really want an error to show up, but in this example, I'm not going to show in the internals of handling, negotiating, doing something new. I'll be showing that in a separate example. So let me just show this here. Let's go here. So I'm going to load this up again, and let's go to sign out. Let's go to sign in. So I'm going to try to be Bob, and this is what happens, right? So the scheme is wrong, and when it redirects, it doesn't like that scheme, so it won't even let me continue, right? So it's going to ask for it's looking for something else, basically. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the API side, which is probably, the more interesting side, because when you have React front ends and or Angular front ends or Vue.js, all of your front ends are probably calling APIs through hopefully a BFF or backend for front end, but sometimes direct from the browser. Now, we prefer they don't go direct from the browser because tokens in the browser is not a good idea. It's definitely deprecated and recommended not to do. But there's a lot of legacy out there that still does that today, to redirect to OpenID Connect, come back and use it in the browser. So one way or the other, you have another app that's calling APIs and needing to pass a token from somewhere, right? And again, it can either come from the browser direct to the API, or it can come through a backend for front end that does the routing on the server side. So when I think about APIs, then I'm going to have possibly massive number of different APIs for my whole entire solution, different domains, right? And then those are called by the various micro front ends or by the one big app that has different areas. And so to set up my API authorization and authentication, I'm going to add the same similar services to DI, right? I need to add authentication, but this time I also add the JWT bearer, which means I'm looking for a bearer token to arrive to my API as a requirement. So we're installing that in the DI system. We're adding the HTTP client so that we can talk to identity. And then we are adding authorization so that we can do authorization requirements, right? So we're just stuffing that into DI. And that's just showing, setting up the configuration for identity here so that you can know how do I validate role claims and name claims, by providing the claim type. And then that way the default check, require role will work properly because it will know what the name of the role claim is. So that's assuming my role claim is actually called role, which usually it is, but you can change that. And then when we do our builder, we're just saying we're going to use authentication authorization. And then ultimately, for minimal APIs, what we end up doing is it's a little bit different. We can, instead of having things scattered across my controllers, where it's a little bit harder to investigate, like what's where is all my authorization, what are all my policies. You can do some amount of centralized policies with the MVC version, but with the minimal APIs, you can actually make it very declarative right here in line, which is super helpful. And you can use that for things like unit testing and validation. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So minimal APIs basically, just give us some new tools for the authorization piece that are worth showing. And so we'll focus on that. So obviously require authorization will require the default authorization policy, which usually just says the user's authenticated. It wants a token and it has to be valid, okay? Here we've got, an endpoint called list claims. So the way minimal APIs work is you create a method, not a controller. So you can have a bunch of, methods on a class. They could be static, but they're just methods that you attach to an endpoint. So you can reuse the same method and put it on different endpoints even, different routes, if that made sense, right? So essentially you define your method, it's a class, you tell the route with map get that this is the method we're going to call when somebody calls the root, okay? And then on the end of that, we're saying we want to require authorization on this endpoint. So I can, on a per endpoint basis, have different policies and different requirements, or I can do it in groups, which I'll show you both. So basically, require authorization just says I need the user to be authenticated. I got a token, and that's the default policy. So let's take a look at that. So right now my UI, I'm going to fix this or else we'll still have an error, right? So we'll go back to this. And I don't need to authorize here because I'm already doing that by default. So we'll do that. And then let me go to now, I'm going to close this up. And I'm going to go to the API. So let's go up here. And here's my API. So, okay. So in our program CS, right, you can see I've got add authentication bearer, like I told you. We've got our settings for the bearer token that we're expecting. And then we've got add authorization with no other policies yet. And I've got some other stuff I'll add later, so we won't look at that yet. And then we're essentially saying use authorization. So we're getting the default behavior, except for this one line that says require authorization on this list claims endpoint at the root, okay? So we'll just go ahead and, go here. And let me rerun this. All right, so let's go here, copy, not the HTML, and we will run this again. Okay, so my UI is here, right? And so the endpoint that I'm calling that is the root is this get token endpoint. If I call it and I don't have a token, then I get an unauthorized because I haven't passed a token on the call, right? So I don't get that unless I call here and, say my name's Bob. And now I can call and I'll get my, claims back from the call. So that API is returning my claims back, basically, okay? So this is pretty simple. All I did was require authorization. That was the default, and that is applying to all the endpoints I might add. But I did it actually on a single endpoint basis this time. Now, what I could also do is I could come over here and let's see, let me just stop this again. And I can add a group instead. So you can create a group at the root and you can give it that base authorization. What that requires you to do is essentially, save the, the route builder on the other side, and as you add all your other endpoints, and in those endpoints, you don't have to specify require authorization because what you've done is you've done it at the root of the API, path, and everything below, if you like, can have the same policy. Okay. Now, if you start finding that you have this base policy and then you want to apply a bunch of different policies to every single endpoint, that starts to get kind of nasty. And that's when you need to get into using policies that will encapsulate a group of rules and have those execute. So we'll get to that in a second. But the point of this is just to show, I could add a map and use the same endpoint and create some different, routes for that endpoint, and they will all now have the same authorization requirement, basically. So I can turn this one off, and I can come back here. All right, so let's see, copy. And we'll put that here. And now we'll go here again. And I don't know if I need to sign him out yet. I guess not. And now I think we have a claims. If I added the endpoint, I might not have. Not sure. Oh, I did. Good. Yeah, so those are all working now. And before they had a 404, but now they have a route, right? So I've added the route. I'm getting a default behavior. If I sign out, then that means they all would behave the same way as token, which is unauthorized. Okay? So they inherited the same. Yep. Okay. All right, so pretty straightforward, but again, kind of interesting, the map get, the map route, if you haven't used the minimal APIs yet, and it lets you sort of, you don't have to put it in line in your program CS. You could obviously have some separate classes that group some lengthy set of API endpoints, but it's very easy to read and follow and clean, and you don't have to have that, the HTTP side of it mixed with, the implementation parts, which is really what the class is doing. So it's kind of a neat alternative. Okay, so let's talk about then, we started discussing role-based access control is the first stop, right? So all we've done so far is set up authentication, require authentication, make sure that there's a user logged in at the UI, make sure that there's a user or a token that's valid at the server side, right? But we can do other demands, like for role-based, we can require a role, we can require a claim called role, which is redundant, or we can, and that might be useful if you had to do something like put a list of roles and do many, right? That's okay. Different role types or name types. And then add requirements. I can do like a custom encapsulated, requirement that lets me pull in some business logic that maybe loads from a database or a config, things that I want to manage, right? So roles coming from a list or something like that. So these are all some ways we can do RBAC with the roles, okay? So let's go to, let's see if I'm running. I'm going to stop running for a sec. And let's go back to our other example. So I'm going to go close that up, bring back my map route here, and then let's go to the top. So let me close this here. All right. So basically, here, at this point, we've got add authorization, but we haven't put any policies yet on the authorization. So what we can do is we can add config, right? And we can, let me get rid of this, we can add, I'll just add like the first one here for an example, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm adding, it's not liking that, hang on. Yeah. 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 There we go. Okay, so if I add the policy, then what I'm doing is I'm saying add it, call it roles, and then this is going to require the role admin. So what I'm doing down here is I'm saying, okay, so here is my, endpoint for roles. So let's add that endpoint in. And that route, I'm saying require authorization and use the roles policy. So this is not doing, this is basically going to defer to the roles policy above in order to do the authorization piece, okay? So that policy right now is just the one thing. So let's go ahead and run that. And then we'll start looking at the order of requirement execution and things like that. So, okay. All right. And so we got another route here. Oops. Go here. And so I'm going to, okay, so right now if I call roles, it's unauthorized, obviously, so I need to sign in. Now I'm asking for admin, so I'm going to go to Alice. Alice is an admin. And so now I'm going to call data. We'll see Alice has admin role. And I'm going to call roles, and we see that we get it, right? Makes sense? So then I sign out. I log in as Bob. Bob's not an admin, so let's do Bob. And I go to get roles, and it's forbidden because obviously I don't have the right role, right? Okay, pretty simple. So that's one way to do it, right? But we can also do claims-based. And so another way that you might consider is to add a claim where I check the role. So I can just say add claim, I don't know, I'll just add it here. So if I do this, and I'll just get that over here. Okay, so if I add another policy and I say require claim, and the claim says role admin, then I've got two different policies called role. What do you think will happen? So what it does is a dictionary, and the last one wins. So this won't really be useful at all. But it's interesting to observe. So I'm going to just comment this one out. And we'll just use the new one. So let's go ahead and run it. And let's go here, copy, and go. That's all right. So I am logged in as Bob still. I call the role. I'm forbidden. Let's see if it works for Alice. I'm going to log in as Alice. Have to spell it right. Oops, I didn't spell it right. Typing is hard. And Alice gets in. Why? Because she has admin, right? So all works. Now, what you'll notice is you don't really get any logs from this. Like, so, we don't see any of those handlers processing. So one of the challenges with these requirements handlers is they don't support DI injection unless you separate the authorization handler interface from the implementation, and then you can inject DI, like a logger and other things. So when you create your own, authorization requirements, you want to make sure that you separate that so you can introduce anything like a call to an external database or a lookup somewhere or another API call, or even as simple as logging, okay? So that you can introduce that. So let's come in here and talk about what we did here with the claim. So all I did was require a different kind of requirement, but it's not custom at all, right? So I'm going to take this out, and we're going to try something different. So the other thing you can do, so let's go down here, is you can create multiple claims in the same policy, which makes more sense. So if I come in here, and I add, config add policy, and first thing I'm adding it to the claims endpoint. It doesn't matter which endpoint. And I'm going to say, I want to require the scope of API, which is the caller, and I want to require this thing called admin requirement. So come over here, and I'll go to the definition. And what this is a authorization requirement, custom, with a name, admin requirement. And the goal of that is, so that I can just encapsulate my own rules, right? I could go look up a config, pull in the roles we want to check, go to a database, whatever makes sense for that, okay? So this custom requirement now will let me also have access to logs. So if you go back to the requirement, actually no, that's the next one. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so I'll run this, and all this means is the same exact admin role that we were doing before, only this time it's a custom permission or a custom requirement. So I'll copy that, and we'll load this up. And let's go to the right and click on the same UI. Oops. And if you go to Alice, then the claims endpoint right now says not found. Why is that? I know why. I didn't add the endpoint. I meant to do that. So, okay, so let's go back to program. And we'll get here. All right, so what I did here is interesting, right? I added a policy called claims, and I did not add the claims endpoint, so when I go to that, it's not coming up. So let's see. Go here. Let's add the claims endpoint. And so this will now look for my claims policy that I just created that's looking for a scope and looking for also the user, right? The admin role. All right? Okay. So let's take that URL and go over here again. And all right. So now we've got Alice signed in. We're going to go to claims, and that works, right? Because now we have, not only are we admin, and it works, but also I actually added the endpoint, which is a good thing. Okay, now the other thing is we didn't have any logging happening there, but what we didn't test is whether or not that API requirement works. So let me just kind of scroll back up as a reminder, right? If I say API 2 instead, right, then I don't have API 2 as a claim. So if I kill this and run it again, and I'm going for the most rebuilds of a speaker, rebuild and run for the whole conference. I think there's a vote sometime. That was supposed to be funny. Okay, so now it's forbidden, right? Because the API token doesn't match. Now, of course, you would believe me if we had logs, but we don't have logs because, unfortunately, these particular attributes don't, have the DI injection. So let's move forward on that. So I'm going to take these out of play. All right, and we'll just get rid of this. All right. And I've got a couple of different ones here. So we've got a, this one here is the one I want to do. Okay, so I'm going to illustrate a different, experience here, and that is I'm adding a policy to the roles endpoint. I'm requiring the API claim like I just did, and that one won't show me, any logs. But now I'm adding requirements with what's called a custom requirement with dependency injection, and it's looking for an admin role. So let me show you what that looks like. So what this is an authorization requirement, interface separated from implementation, so I can do DI. This is called custom requirement with dependency injection. Then it's basically saying, okay, so when we handle the requirement, when the requirement is requested, it's expecting to be passed a requirement, which is the name of the admin role. And we're going to iterate through the roles in order to, decide whether or not the task completed properly, right? Now, you'll notice I've got a logger in here, so I can say whether it succeeded or failed. I can also do context.fail, which will end up telling the runtime, if this fails, don't continue to evaluate, and you can make a decision whether the first failing requirement should stop all processing or not. So there's a couple things to talk about there. So right now, that just adds that one, so let's go take a look. And then the other one is admin requirement with dependency injection. So if I go to that definition, again, authorization requirement is the marker interface. And then what I'm doing is I'm implementing a handler that says it's just meant for admin, right? I might load that from a list or a file, you get the idea. And it's going to log as well. And it could also do, a fail, and I could log what the failure is. So now I've got two separate, loggable things. And then I've got a require claim scope API, right? So that's on the roles interface. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And the order of this will be interesting, right? So like I'll do that in a second. So let's go here, and I'll go back to let's see. I got to get the URL, yeah. And let's go back here. And let's run the UI again, and I am Alice, and I applied that to roles. So it looks like I got in, right? I have API, that's the correct scope. I have the role admin, I got in, but I also can come in here and I can see, that we called the requirement with success, yeah? Okay. Now if I kind of come over here and log out and sign in as Bob, so let's go here, and we'll sign in as Bob. Oh, I just told you the password. And that's forbidden. So now I don't know why it's forbidden, but I can come over here, I can look at the logs, and you're going to see custom requirement fail, and you're going to see admin requirement, fail, right? So they both failed, basically. Now what's interesting here is the fail, is in separate combination from the API requirement, right? But you have to indicate whether or not you want to invoke handlers after failure or not, or if you'd like to stop, everything. So I can do this, and this will pull in a setting that lets me halt processing. Now, how many people think it's a good idea for me to halt processing after the first failure? Nobody. It depends. Yeah. No, really, it's probably not a good idea because you don't always know the order things are going to execute. Now, we can control the order of the requirements in here, but if you add multiple policies, we don't know the order of that. That's a completely separate thing. And it's actually probably not a best practice to have multiple policies on the same endpoint, because now it becomes chaotic and hard to manage, right? Like you need to kind of know and predict what the order is of things and have a design for that. So if I run this now with a different requirement that says user, right? So I'm going to say user. So let's go ahead and run it, and let's see. All right. And we'll go ahead and copy that, and we'll load that up. And we will go here again. I am Bob. I go to roles. I'm forbidden. So why am I forbidden is the question, right? So we're going to go over here, and we're going to see what the logs tell me. And it says here, admin requirement fail. And it looks like I didn't even execute the other one, which means admin requirement cut it off, right? Now, that's not always going to happen. It depends on the order these are processed. So it's interesting. I had a custom requirement here, and then I had admin requirement second. Why did the other one go first, right? And so down here, the order of how we're adding in, oops, wait, maybe I need it here. Yeah, here it is. So admin requirement went first, regardless. But what will happen is it will pick up admin, and any of the policies or requirements that match admin, it will execute first. So it's not exactly going to go in order of my requirements as listed. It's going to go in order of the first requirement in the pipeline and its handler, finish those, and then go to the next one. So if I switch this order, it's going to do the opposite, basically, right? So let's go up here, copy and paste, and let's try it again. So now I'm going to go in here, I'm going to hit roles. I'm forbidden as Bob. Why am I forbidden? I'm going to come in here, I'm going to see admin requirement still fail. Did I mean that? Did I order it that way? I don't remember now. No, I put the custom. I think you have to restart it twice before it does the right thing. Hang on a second. Or log out again. Did you save? Did I save? Oh, damn, I didn't save. That would be a more logical solution, right? Okay. Are you pair coding with me? That's so awesome. Pair programming.
I'm your GitHub co-pilot.
My co-pilot. A live one. Wow. Okay. So now I'll go here. Hello, Bob. That's probably why. So now we're going to come over here, and we're going to see why that's happening. Console, API, custom requirement is the one that failed this time, right? So that makes sense. Now, if I turn that off, right, the whole requirement order deal, so if I turn this off, oops, then what's going to happen is anything that succeeds can succeed as long as we don't fail inside the custom implementation. So for example, if you want to allow anything that succeeds to allow you in, then you need to not fail, but rather just let it pass through. You don't call succeed, but you don't call fail. And if you don't call fail, then it won't actually, it'll allow a different requirement to allow you to succeed and get in, if that makes sense. So what we'll do is go back to the program. And what I'll do is I'll jump in this other custom requirement, go to, and we'll shut off the fail. And oops, and then we'll rerun. I saved this time. Oops, I didn't mean to do that.
You have a different terminal.
Yeah, exactly. We're
Go back to code, and then you have
oh. Wait.
a new terminal.
I don't know what you're telling me. Here. I don't know what that just did.
Terminal, there. On the bottom, terminal. You have problems output button.
Yeah?
Terminal.
Yeah.
And then on the right. Select the
Oh, gosh, thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. I usually work on terminal. Okay. And this is a tiny window. My resolution is not quite big. Okay. Good thing I brought my glasses. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm Bob, and I am forbidden, but I might not have any roles. So I have to come in here, and I have to be Alice, and then Alice, and I can go here. Oh, and I'm still forbidden. So I did something else wrong, didn't I? That's all right. That's why you do it live, right? Custom requirement fail. I still have a fail going on. I didn't save it, did I? Probably. Well, we'll just pretend that worked because I need to move to the next one. You get the idea. Okay, so one thing that I do want to make sure we get to is if you have a more complex situation, like, let me see, where am I? I'm in my web. So I'm going to close some of these things so I can find the right thing. We're going to go to the API, and we're going to find our program. So all of this is fine. This is on the roles endpoint. I've shown you adding to the different endpoints, different types of requirements, and a few custom requirements. And the fact that the order and whether or not you fail is important and relevant. But and also those, by the way, had to be added right into the builder services so that we have access to those in the pipeline in the DI. And so what I want to do here is I want to show a different example. So imagine now you got a whole bunch of policies you're trying to hand code, and you've got to do some sort of design on the back end of your application, right? So, role-based is fine. I can do some roles if that's all I have, right? I've talked about the authorization handlers. There are also require permission where you could have permission, like permission equals X, but then that means the token's got to carry those, and that's going to probably bloat the token. So at some point, I need to get those permissions from somewhere else. I have to either build a plan for it, use a system like OPA or Auth0 if I'm using Auth0, or like another endpoint, right? So I have a little tool for that called Policy Server, so I'm going to use that as the example, but it doesn't really matter what it is. You just need something you can call that manages, how do we schedule users and roles and authorize and centralize authorization and audit it, right? At some point, you'll go there. So it allows you to do more rich things like attribute-based, attribute-based would be just possibly additional claims on the token, but you might want also their IP address and what time of day are they allowed to log in. Those are things that you're not going to want to create from scratch if you can get a database that handles that for you, right? It's a lot to design. Same with resource-based, right? I need to go check, do I own the document or not? In which case, let's go get the document and bring it back. And if not, then, I would reject the request, right? So we've already talked about this. I did want to touch on, for minimal API though, one of the things that you can do is, because they're in classes separate, and because we're doing DI injection for all these requirements, the custom requirements, you can fully unit test those and automate it. But even better, you can write reports that essentially scan your code base and scan the alignment of all the requirements to your endpoints and state this is the expectation for these endpoints, which helps you produce authorization tests. And it also helps you take that over to the authorization system, if you have one, to say, is as designed as implemented. And you can do the validation of that. So doing these minimal API endpoints, there's really no downside to it. It's all, it really enables a lot of capabilities there. And if you're doing an external authorization system, maybe there's some terms for this in the industry, like, your policy enforcement point is your application enforcing the policy somehow by calling into the central system. Your PDP is your policy decision point that decides, did the policy pass or not? Your policy information point is things like, what are the roles and permissions that we got out of the system, for example. So these are all just standard things that you might have, like where the system has a back end and client applications, a management UI, and then you've got other applications that integrate with it, right? So, and then that lets you do what we would call context-based access control, where you can do, what tenant are you? What project are you in? What workflow are we in the middle of? What time of day is it? Are you in a certain region? Are there temporal things like you're allowed access during 9 to 5 only? There's a ton of things you can do when you have like a rich back-end system. So it intersects all the, role-based, context-based, attribute-based, and context all in one, right? So that's a big topic. And this is sort of like, just to give you an idea what a design might look like when you're looking at how do you map out your authorization. Like, it can be a pretty big deal. I threw these slides in because there's a lot of good information in here. And it might be, fun to look at, but not right now. And then API-oriented, again, same thing. It's got a lot of data about like how we look at this from a, I guess, industry nomenclature perspective, right? The taxonomies. So just keep that for yourself. Now, what I do want to do before we go is I want to show you this particular thing where, if you can notice, the map here is saying I'm going to a data route, and I might go to area 1 or area 2. Let's say it's a feature in the API, like a route for a certain feature for the application, and I want to authorize with a custom solution. I'm going to call out to an actual system called policy server in this case. And if I go to the definition of this, again, mostly it's still an authorization policy that we're creating, right? But at the end of the day, what it is doing is it's making a call in the evaluate to, oh, this is my conditions, so hang on. Authorize with, yeah, it's kind of buried down there in there. But basically, we have a policy resolution builder that will go build the policy we want to go after. So if it's area 1, it will pass that in and say evaluate that area and give me my permissions and roles and things back based on the policy. And then we can add metadata to the actual endpoint. And when you do that, now your endpoint has access to that metadata to try to enforce, which is interesting. So in here, what you see is a complete taxonomy made with the same tools so that you can build a declarative looking language for what your conditions are. Like, if you have this role and you have, these 2 permissions, you can get to the endpoint, for example, right? And so I'm just going to give it a run so that you can see how that kind of works. And then I'll make sure the code's available. I'm going to put it on my GitHub, actually. I just need to clean it up a bit. And I usually put the slides, they'll ask for the slides, but I'll usually put those up on LinkedIn or SlideShare too, so just also so you know. Okay, so I'm going to copy that. And let's go ahead and, all right, so I'm going to run in here. I'm going to be Alice, and I'm going to call, no, not policy, sorry, policy server. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a call to area 1, and it's telling me what I should get. Now, why do I know that? Because over here, in my endpoints, I have a mapping for my users to which users have area 1 and which users have area 2. And my users are in here. This is just hard-coded, obviously. Alice is number 1. And Alice has, the subject ID 1 and then 2, and Chris doesn't have any roles at all, right? So he's only going to be policy-based. So basically, when I'm calling this policy, it's executing that rich policy implementation, but it's actually going to another system, and it's taking a look at area 1, and who's an admin. Alice is an admin, right? And it's giving Alice her admin rights. And it's calling, this is just a UI for it in a small screen right now. But basically, there's an engine behind this that will evaluate Bob, right, based on whatever area we're in. And if I go to area 2, I can come in here. But this also means I have a central place where I can add and remove people. Like Chris is only in area 2, so he would get a limited result, right? So, oops. So basically, if I sign out, sign in, get in as Chris, who doesn't have any roles, and execute this for him, then I'm going to get forbidden on area 1 because he's not in there, and I'm going to get OK for area 2. And if I came in here and I delete him, then basically when I come over here and try again, I'm now forbidden, right? So the idea is you have a central place, it manages all that stuff, and then you can create these policies that can call out and do it. So with that being said, the point is you have to design up front. There's a lot to think about, but these were the tools, and there's probably more we could dig into because there's a lot of other customizations we could do. Feel free to send me any questions. I'll put the sample somewhere and make the slides available, and hope you enjoyed that. Have a great day.